welcome to another episode of Beyond the Indus. And for the next couple of months, as part of our Road to 24 series, we're going to be focusing on the upcoming 2024 Indian elections, set to take place in April and May. And as part of that, we're going to be doing a deep dive on the different political alliances contesting the election, their origins, philosophies, campaign promises, and strategies, so we can give you, our listeners, a deeper understanding of the political forces at play in the upcoming election. And this episode, specifically, we're going to be talking about the BJP, focusing on Narendra Modi and his brand of Hindutva politics. But before we get to that, we'd like to give you an update on the Pakistan election. The election, which we covered last episode, threw up some surprising results. And to help break that down, we're joined by my colleague and fellow Berliner, Leo Vega. Leo is one of the leading lights of Berlin's small but growing South Asia policy community. He's an associate partner and the director of South Asia and Eurasia at the Candid Foundation, an independent think tank and project hub based in Berlin. Leo is also an editor for Zenit magazine, Germany's leading magazine focused on the political, cultural, and economic issues ongoing in the Middle East. And he's a regular contributor on West Asia and South Asia geopolitics in German and international media. Leo, it's great to have you on. I believe you're in India right now for Rasina. Where in the world are you right now?
That's correct. Hi, Tushar. Yes, I'm currently in India, but just here in South Asia for a bit. So I'm going to Sri Lanka afterwards and then to Bangladesh.
So yeah, Leo, so jumping to the Pakistan election, you and I were both live texting each other during the counting when the results were coming out in February. It was surprising to see that the early results were showing a thumping lead for Imran Khan-backed PTI candidates, despite all the pressures that Imran Khan and his political party had been facing in the lead up to the election. As obviously the election results, over the next few days came out fully, we saw that lead had reduced substantially, and it seems that coalition of the other political parties are going to come to power. But what do you think about the outcome of this election? Were you surprised at all by the results? And maybe how credible are reports that poll rigging has been taking place against Imran Khan's candidates, which led to the fall in his majority? What do you think of those issues?
Frankly, Tushar, I was surprised. Yes, I think like many other observers as well. But I think I should not have been surprised because the dots were all visible, laying all open. I was visiting Pakistan in October last year, and I gained the impression that Imran Khan and his PTI was, despite his arrest, still extremely popular, that everything the establishment in Pakistan was trying to change, that did not work at all. That quite to the contrary, the suppression of Imran Khan, the raids against the PTI, the bending of the level playing field was actually feeding into Imran Khan's image as a bigger-than-life figure, as someone, maybe the only one in the country, who can change the trajectory of Pakistan for many of the supporters, which are largely people who are in their idealization of Imran Khan as a savior, driven by their deep resentment of the political status quo. That was one thing that was quite clear to me when I visited last year. And on the other hand, I got the impression that whatever people were raging about, the return and the popularity of Nawaz Sharif, the former prime minister, had to be taken with a grain of salt. That actually even many PLMN supporters went private conversations concerned about the lack of real grassroots support for Nawaz. And I remember one conversation quite clearly with a party worker of the PMLN that voiced her concern that even in some of the strongholds of the party in the walled city of Lahore, the shopkeepers were openly sharing their anger about the party and the rising prices with her. So I sensed that even the PMLN understood that their old ways of doing politics, their 1990 style campaign was not moving hearts in their Punjabi heartland anymore. So short term, there was a moment of surprise here when the PTI-backed candidates actually emerged at the top. But zooming out a bit from the immediate result of the election, the surprise is actually not that big, I think, because in the end, it's the expected coalition government between the PMLN and the PPP and others that ended up forming the government.
So yeah, speaking about the coalition between the PMLN and the PPP, funnily enough, the last government before the election was a similar coalition, the PDM. And a lot of analysts have suggested that them coming into power at a time of national crisis was one of the things that led to Imran Khan's rise in popularity just before the election. So, what are the prospects for the new coalition led by, I guess, Shehbaz Sharif as prime minister that has come to power? What sort of challenges are they facing? And do you think this coalition will last until the next election?
I think it's quite obvious that the new government is facing tremendous challenges, like both on an international stage and on a domestic stage as well, that it's really time of national emergency at the moment in many ways. Because I think the most pressing crisis that the government is facing is, of course, the incredibly looming financial and debt crisis that Pakistan is facing. I think the number of loans that have to be paid back in the next couple of months is amounting to $24 billion. They need a new IMF deal, probably already by the end of this month. Yeah, I mean, the ways of doing that are not easy for the country, for the new government. Relatively speaking, they have a better track record of working with international donors and from the West, but also from Turkey, China, and the GCC. But I think the appetite basically everywhere to help out Pakistan is very, very low. It's not very good in the GCC. It's, like in China, there's also the sense of a lack of return of investment. Frankly speaking, can't be bothered. Why would the US and the EU invest a lot of money into Pakistan at the moment? So this is a very, very difficult situation. So I expect a very rocky start for this new government. I expect that this, tradition of Pakistani governments not to stand for the entire term might continue with this one as well. But I also, frankly speaking, I think it's also too early for doomsday scenarios. But if there's one thing that the Pakistani establishment is very good at, then it is to actually retain the status quo, find a way out without a full collapse of Pakistan. So I think, but it's also a fresh start to a certain extent and a new chance for the PPP and for the PMLM and also for the military leadership to change and reform to a certain extent, to adapt to the challenging times and to the, changing environment internationally as well.
And lastly, I guess the question out there is, what happens now to Imran Khan and his supporters? He's still currently languishing in jail, seemingly with more and more cases lodged against him. Is there a future for the PTI in Pakistani politics? And more importantly, have his supporters accepted the mandate, or is there trouble brewing in the future?
Yes, I think the PTI is definitely there to stay. The PTI is not, vanishing from the political landscape in Pakistan, even if that was the goal. And I think it was of the military establishment prior to the February 8 elections. This has not been successful. So the PTI will stay around, and frankly speaking, they even got their own power base again, because Chief Minister of KPK, of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, is an independent supported by the PTI. So to a certain extent, I think the PTI can have it easier now than before, because they can regroup, use their strength. They have the upper hand as well because of the surprise election result, even though, of course, I expect harassment from, the security apparatus to increase even further. And frankly speaking, one of the biggest challenges for the PTI would have actually been to form a government at this very, very difficult time. Despite all the shortcomings of the current parties, let's not forget one thing. Imran Khan government was ruling the country until April 2022, has a very, very poor track record. They did a terrible job, let's be frank, in governing Pakistan. They are not actually an alternative when it comes to political solutions to the current challenges. And I think Imran Khan was very unpopular in China. He was very unpopular with the US. He was constantly insulting the US. He was very unpopular in the GCC countries as well. I don't think like an Imran Khan government would have had a real way out of the current economic crisis of Pakistan. So actually just letting them do their thing, letting them govern the country according to the popular mandate, that I think PTI would have gotten in completely free and fair elections in Pakistan, would probably be the most dangerous thing for the PTI in terms of political survival. Even though, of course, the current establishment is so hated by so many people in Pakistan that they would be quite lenient on him. And, I think for a long time, he could blame others for, his own failures as a politician. But eventually, after some time in government, there would be no other way, no other scenario possible than actually a drastic realization among many of his supporters that Imran Khan is indeed not the savior that they are hoping for.
Fantastic, Leo. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, on to the main subject for this podcast. To say that the BJP under Modi is extraordinarily successful is somewhat of an understatement. In 2023, Pew Research conducted a survey which showed that Narendra Modi had the highest favorability ratings of any leader in the world at 80% 9 years into his tenure. And the BJP, which claims to have 180 million members, is larger than the Chinese Communist Party by membership. To understand why that happened and what that means for the upcoming Indian election, we have to understand the ideology that drives Modi and the BJP, Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, with the RSS as the cultural organization backing it. Despite a lot of coverage on the BJP and Hindutva in international media over the past 10 years, there doesn't seem to be a deep understanding of what Hindutva actually is, with a lot of opinions veering towards one extreme or the other. So our next guest is going to help us break down what Hindutva or Hindu nationalism means for India, how it's affecting India's society and culture, which are the organizations driving and influencing it, and how it's impacting the BJP's governance of India. Stay tuned. So joining us today is Akhilesh Pillalamari. Akhilesh is an international affairs analyst, journalist, and lawyer focusing on geopolitics, international security, comparative law and politics, and history. He's written over 300 articles, many of which are featured in The Diplomat. And in fact, I believe we've quoted his articles on a couple of occasions in previous podcasts. So it's a real pleasure to have him on today. So Akhilesh, thanks for joining and welcome to Beyond the Indus.
Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. So to dive into, let's say, the origins and the ideology of the BJP, even though the modern BJP has existed since the 1980s, the cultural organization at the heart of Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, is the RSS, and that has a much longer history. So perhaps to start with, could you give us an overview of the RSS and the wider Sangh Parivar, as it's called, and their activities during the first few decades after India's independence in 1947?
Sure. The story starts a bit before independence, so I'll start with that. The RSS, which translates into English as the National Volunteer Organization, was founded in 1925. This is during the British Raj. And during this period, the last few decades before the British Raj ended, there were a lot of movements that were founded in India for different purposes, some seeking independence, some seeking cultural revival, some, such as the Muslim League, went on to help found Pakistan. So, during this era in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, because of mass transportation, the spread of the printing press, the spread of the radio, a lot of organizations began to form. And so one of these was the RSS, which is the Hindu Revivalist Organization. It wasn't the only one. The Sangh Parivar refers to a family of different Hindu Revivalist organizations, the most prominent of which is the RSS, but it's not the only one. The RSS became the most prominent because it organized a very tight structure. It's a little like the Boy Scouts in the West. Their branches in all cities, that children go to RSS schools, they're trained. So it has a sort of pan-India Hindu educational purpose. After independence, the RSS was a little controversial because one of its members was the assassin of Mahatma Gandhi, who was the leader of the Indian independence movement. The interesting thing is while the RSS is this umbrella organization of they promote an ideology called Hindutva, which means Hinduness, which seeks to establish an India based on the Hindu tradition and a Hindu civilization. Different organizations that grew out of the RSS, and one of them ended up being the BJP, but that was in the 1980s. But before that, there were many other RSS-based organizations, and one such one was the Jan Sangh, which is a political party that RSS members founded way back in the 1950s. And the first leader of this party actually used to be in Nehru's cabinet. Nehru was the first prime minister of India from Congress. So one of the interesting things during this period of India's independence is Congress Party, which was the dominant party. Today we know it as a secular left-wing party, but back then it was a big umbrella party. It had a leftist wing. It also had a more traditional Hindu wing. Many of the leaders of Congress had views on the role of Hinduism in modern India that are not too dissimilar from people in the BJP today. But because of different power tussles in the early Congress, Nehru and his faction went out, and many people who used to be in Congress left and started other organizations, or they joined with people from the RSS to create other parties, one of which is this Jan Sangh that I just talked about. This Jan Sangh never really won more than 5 to 10% of the popular vote in any election, but eventually in the 1970s, after the Congress Prime Minister Indira Gandhi declared an emergency, the Jan Sangh allied with a lot of other parties, socialist parties, leftist parties, regional parties. They all came together, and they did win an election that forced Indira Gandhi out. So this is the next stage of the movement, the story of the right-wing politics in India, because after Congress left, it opened the field for a lot of new parties to grow. And, we could talk now about the growth of the BJP, I guess, at this point.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that the Jan Sangh never really gained a lot of popularity in the first few decades of post-independence. But in the 1980s, when I believe the Jan Sangh was reborn in a new avatar, the BJP, it sort of evolved from a marginal player in Indian politics to a major political party, commonly attributed to a series of events that happened in the mid to late 1980s. So could you describe the events that led to this rise? And maybe also talk about what role the RSS and other Hindu nationalist or Hindutva organizations had in supporting that rise.
Yeah, so to start off with, the BJP was founded, it was a new incarnation of an older party. It was founded in the early 1980s. And in the first election it contested in 1984, it only won 2 seats in the Lok Sabha, which is the lower house of parliament in India. By 1996, just 12 years later, it had become the largest party in parliament. So a lot of events in the 1980s and 1990s led to this. I think the primary event that led to the growth of the BJP was the growth of the Ram Mandir movement. The Ram Mandir movement was this movement to build a temple on the birthplace of Lord Ram, who's a very important god for Hindus, in Ayodhya. At that time, there was a mosque on that site. So the BJP led a movement to have this temple built and this mosque demolished. The temple, by the way, has just been inaugurated just a couple of months ago. So they did finally achieve this goal. But in the late 80s, some of the movement leaders of the BJP, particularly Lal Krishna Advani and Vajpayee, who later became prime minister, they led this movement. They led something called the Ram Rath Yatra in 1990, which was this big march of volunteers, many of whom had RSS backgrounds, to march to Ayodhya and advocate for this Ram temple being built. At this point, the BJP and the RSS were not yet completely distinct. RSS cadres were a major part of the founding of the BJP, the foot soldiers of the BJP, but they were not the only people in the BJP. The BJP has always claimed to be a party that's technically independent of the RSS, and to a certain extent, after winning power in the elections of 96, and then they won a bigger share of seats in subsequent elections in 1998 and 1999, the BJP did try to put a little distance between themselves and the RSS. This was when Vajpayee was prime minister, and I think Vajpayee believed that the BJP could only evolve into a bigger party after they became a bigger tent, and that would involve, putting some space between themselves and the RSS. But the RSS and the idea of Hindutva was very instrumental to the formation of the BJP and its initial rise, because with the Ram Mandir movement, and then which culminated in the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992, this really won them a lot of votes in North India in particular, where devotion to Ram is very strong. But I do want to point out that at this time, Congress was also struggling. Congress went from, the dominant party in the Indian political system to this play that needed to be in coalitions with other parties to even have a stab at forming the government. So this period in the 1980s and 1990s was a period of fragmentation in Indian politics, where Congress declined, the BJP began to rise, and there was a lot of realignment amongst the voters of India about over whom they would support.
Right, and I guess it's also a function, when Vajpayee came to power, it's a function of the sort of coalition politics that he had to play, because he needed several coalition partners. They couldn't really execute the goals that they had that were sort of more Hindu nationalist or Hindutva. They had that restraint on them. But after Modi has come to power in 2014 with a solid majority, I guess the charge against the BJP is that they want to establish Hindu Rashtra, or Hindu nation, basically influencing India's nominally secular and independent governmental and judicial institutions to sort of ally closer with their Hindutva ideology. I think, in fact, the author Vinay Sitapati claimed that we're already sort of living in a version of the Hindu Rashtra. They are effecting legal changes. But what is your opinion on this? What sort of constitutional and legal changes have the BJP sought, and to what extent have they been successful?
India still is governed under the constitution that came into effect in 1950. This is a Western-style constitution written by a committee that was mostly staffed by members of the Congress Party. So there's no move at the moment to turn India into a formally Hindu state. And I think that would require some amount of legal finesse and also popular support that the BJP doesn't have. So they're working within the confines of the system to try to Hindufy the entity to a certain extent. In some ways, a lot of this is actually within what the Constitution allows. For example, one of the things the BJP supports is something called a Uniform Civil Code, which is the UCC. This would abolish separate personal law of Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. So at the moment, if you want to get married, or you have a divorce, or you need to divide property in a certain way, that is governed differently based on the traditions of the community in India, whether you're Hindu or Muslim or Christian. All the different religious groups in India follow the same criminal code, but not the same family laws. So this UCC is considered a right-wing thing, a BJP thing. It hasn't been implemented on the central level yet, but it's been, some states in India, for example, Uttarakhand in North India recently passed the UCC. And, and it is considered this pro-Hindu thing because the Muslim personal code might, it basically is abolished when the UCC is passed. But the Constitution of India, as it was written in 1950, has Article 44, which directs the government to work toward the UCC. And the idea for UCC is in some ways very Western. It's having the same code of laws for every single citizen in the country. It's based on this notion that arose in the West during the Enlightenment on equality under the laws for every individual, whether poor or rich, noble, not noble, whatever, they all have to follow the same law. And so it's funny that the BJP is advocating this thing that's considered a right-wing thing in some circles, which is in fact a break. It's a example of Hindu modernity because it's a break from the Hindu tradition. If you study the old Hindu law books, like the Manusmriti and other things that are called Shastras, these say that different members of different castes, the law applies to them differently. If someone insults or maims or hurts someone of a socially superior person, they have to pay more. And if they hurt someone of a socially inferior person, they have to pay less. So equality is not part of the tradition of a lot of the ancient Hindu legal, the worldview. So, I do want to note that, the BJP in many ways is a party of Hinduism, but it's a party of Hindu modernity. And they're not looking back necessarily to reviving something that used to be a certain way 2,000 years ago. They're not like the Taliban in that sense. They're not trying to completely go back to some sort of idyllic past. They talk about it a lot. It features in their rhetoric a lot. They don't talk about the golden age of the rule of Ram as a king, the Ram Raja, but like on the ground, they're building a state that's in many ways innovative and new.
Right. Actually, it does remind me of studying history, the Japanese government during the Meiji Restoration in the mid-19th century, when Japan was modernizing, because there were factions of that government that wanted to kick out Westerners completely and go back to traditional ways, but there was an even bigger majority that was focused on modernization while retaining, Japanese values. It's an interesting contrast.
But the Meiji Restoration is actually it's a perfect example. It's a perfect analogy.
Yeah, and talking about, let's say, the cultural changes that have come because of the BJP in India, one of the things that struck me about the Ram Mandir or the Ram Temple inauguration in January was what a sort of mass spectacle it was. And what was particularly, there were campaigns all over India. They declared it a public holiday. They were trying to basically establish some sort of a grassroots campaign in order to paint this as a civilizational renaissance or something like that. To the extent that the main priest inaugurating this function was not the traditional priests, but rather Modi himself in some way. So talking about this, could you maybe talk about, aside from the legal changes, of course, what sort of changes has the BJP tried to effect on the socio-cultural fabric of Indian society? From your vantage point, do you see Indian society, not just its politics, becoming more Hinduized in some ways, or is this an overblown phenomenon?
I do think it's going to become more Hinduized, but not necessarily in a religious way, not necessarily in a theological or theocratic way, but more in a cultural way. And some figures in Indian politics, for example, Jay Shankar, the foreign secretary, he refers to this as civilizational. The India is a civilizational state. There are several places in the world that he thinks are civilizational states, not just nation states, but civilizational as in they are the heirs to an ancient civilization in modern form. And China is an example of this. India is definitely an example. Maybe Russia, maybe Iran, some of these countries that have an unbroken tradition. And I think this is not only a function of the BJP, its worldview and its electoral victories. This is a phenomenon that's occurring throughout the world. A lot of people have talked about the rise of nationalism across different boundaries. And I think this is somewhat of a reaction toward globalism and the spread of a uniform, homogenized global culture that's largely driven by American values and so on and so forth. And I think a lot of countries do want the public life, the intellectual life of their country to be a little more rooted in the traditional, civilization of their country. And a lot of this is kind of just for show. It's like dress up. It's an external thing. They're doing the trappings of traditionalism, but, on a day-to-day basis, modernity spreads in terms of the malls being built and education and literacy spreading to more people. More people are on phones, watching YouTube, TikTok. Their way of life, their way of value, their values are changing. But I think because of this, maybe this fast change due to modernity and Western ways, more and more politicians throughout the world do want to kind of infuse a little of their culture into the public sphere. So I think some of that's what's happening in India. And maybe it's not even a top-down thing. It's also, as more people in India are educated and they're moving beyond the basic needs of survival, they have more time and leisure to think and to explore. They want to know more about their history. They want to travel. They want to, go on pilgrimage to these new temples, or visit the old sites of their civilization. So I think people have more of a sense of where they're coming from, their history and their civilization. Also, as the country becomes richer, as it develops, because they're able to actually think about these things rather than what is their, where they're going to get the next meal or how they're going to get their next meal. It's in some ways moving up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And people want culture, sense of belonging, a sense of culture, and that leads to nationalism, that leads to an exploration of the past.
One of the personal observations that I made on my trip back to India was that the subject of Muslims and Islamophobia, if one can call it that, came up much more frequently in what would have previously been polite conversation. So perhaps people held these ideas, but they'd never talked about it as openly as I noticed this time. So I guess this brings us to the question of the status of minorities, specifically Muslims. In the Western media, we get a lot of stories about discrimination and violence against Muslims in India. To what extent do you think that discrimination and violence has risen against Muslims in India? Or perhaps to what extent are these claims credible? And maybe you could point out the ways in which Muslims are and are not facing discrimination, as opposed to the perception of it.
Yeah, so I mean, as you pointed out, there are a lot of stories in the media, especially the Western media, about status minorities, particularly Muslims. And, I think as a lot of people know, the Hindu-Muslim conflict in India goes back centuries. So I think to a certain extent, the BJP, RSS, and other Hindu organizations, they didn't necessarily create anything new on the ground in terms of attitudes toward Muslims amongst Hindus and vice versa. These two communities have been separate in many ways. They live together, but they're separate. They have often their own areas in the neighborhood, different neighborhoods that they live in. They marry within each other's communities. They, have their own dietary customs. So, the rise of the BJP didn't necessarily change this. The BJP definitely has done well electorally in many cases because of its perceived role as a Hindu party, a protector of Hindus. There have been dog whistles against Muslims, but they never go as far as they, as they could, because they also want to win, to a certain extent, some Muslim votes as well. Because a part of their ideology is we're here for everyone. We're here to develop India for everyone, which includes Muslims. We are the true secular party. That's what the BJP says. Unlike Congress, which they call pseudo-secular, and a lot of BJP figures call Congress that, because they believe Congress gave different financial incentives or made different laws for different religious groups. They favored Muslims in some ways over Hindus. That's part of the BJP ideology. So because the BJP has this ideology where we're the true secular party, we're going to treat everyone equally from a legal constitutional point of view, they haven't really done anything that could be, termed discriminatory or apartheid-like. Certainly not when you think of classical South African style apartheid. It's nothing like that. But India isn't even formally, as a state, legally in the constitution, in the laws, pro-Hindu in the way that Israel declares itself to be the nation state of the Jewish people. India isn't even there yet. But I think on the ground, there's definitely a lot of dog whistling going on, where figures will say to Hindu voters, you should all consolidate behind us instead of voting for different candidates and different parties, because if you don't, your district might get overrun by a high Muslim birth rate because of the demographics in your district, and things like that are going on. In terms of on-the-ground situation, I think, again, because the BJP is rooted in Hindutva and Hindu religion in some ways, there's a sense among some people that the levers of the state are being used to promote Hindu causes in a way that isn't true of how the state would interact with Muslims. As you pointed out, when the Ram Mandir was inaugurated, the sitting prime minister of India basically served as the priest. So, there's some cultural leaning of BJP public officials toward Hinduism that does make it seem like Hinduism is unofficial, official religion in a way. Is this really that different than leaders in some other countries, for example, the United States, going to church? I don't know if there's a huge gap there, to be honest with you. The laws are working the same way for Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and so on. The same amount of money that's distributed toward the poor of a Hindu's bank account goes to a poor Muslim's bank account using this direct transfer scheme that Modi's been promoting. So, I think legally and on the ground, differences aren't that big. Occasionally you hear about some Muslims transporting cows who are lynched on suspicion of, are they transporting this cow for illegal slaughter, for, the consumption of beef. These kinds of things do happen. these things happened before the BJP came into power. There's always been some communal violence in rural India in particular throughout independent India's existence. But, there hasn't been mass violence in the last 10 years, pogroms or that sort of thing that people, I would say, are fear-mongering about because they see the rhetoric, they don't like the rhetoric, and then they think just because of this rhetoric, being spread, the next step is the gas chamber, which I think is just a hyperbole and an exaggeration.
Right. So thanks so much, Akhilesh, for giving us maybe a better understanding of the BJP's ideology and its ideological origins. And thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
When people talk about the BJP in Indian and international media, a lot of focus is put on the ideological and religious aspects of the party. Yet, one of the subjects less covered is the strength of the BJP as a political organization. As political scientist Salvatore Babones puts it, the BJP might be the first modern political machine in India. And sitting atop that machine is Narendra Modi, who uses his own personal popularity and the BJP's organizational strengths to push his party to heights never seen before. And to help us understand Narendra Modi and his political strategies, we have with us Professor Ashutosh Varshney. Professor Varshney is the Saul Goodman Professor of International Studies and Social Sciences and Professor of Political Science at Brown University, where he also directs the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia. He has previously taught at Harvard and the University of Michigan. He's written several books on socio-political issues in India, including Battles Have Won, India's Improbable Democracy, Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life, Hindus and Muslims in India, and India in the Era of Economic Reforms. His research has been recognized and awarded by prestigious institutions like the Guggenheim and Carnegie Fellowships, and his articles and papers have featured in outlets like Foreign Affairs, the Journal of East Asian Studies, and the Indian Express, amongst many, many others. So, Professor Varshney, thank you for joining Beyond the Indus.
Pleasure to join you.
So, Professor Varshney, in 2004 and 2009, the BJP lost the national elections by increasing the large margins. But in 2014, they sort of stormed back into power with a full majority, which is something that's not seen very often in Indian politics, especially since the 80s. This was largely attributed to Narendra Modi, who had been previously elected thrice as the CM of Gujarat. I believe he was in his fourth term, if I'm not mistaken. But before we start talking about the BJP, could you explain Modi's background? What are his origins and what was his political career before his ascension to become Prime Minister of India?
Yeah, so Mr. Modi was born in 1950 in northeast Gujarat, his home state, his native state. And he was not born to privilege. He comes from a relatively underprivileged background. Though not the most underprivileged, by caste, he is what in India is called an OBC, which would be middle caste, between the lowest caste and the upper caste. So he's relatively underprivileged by background, and he says that he supported himself or contributed to the family by helping his father sell tea at railway station. So he uses the term chaiwala, tea seller, anytime it's necessary. And that was a very important part of his persona and his popularity in 2013 and 2014 when the national campaign was launched. A chaiwala, someone who rose from below. And he joined the RSS. So he joined the RSS most probably, as far as we can tell, in 1970 or 71, though he did participate in what are called shakhas as a teenager. And shakhas are these morning exercises, morning assemblies that the RSS leads in many parts of India. And he joined one of them and then became a pracharak. The exact term would mean disseminator or a propagator of the fundamental articles of the ideology and trying to reach out to larger and larger numbers of people, conveying the message. Conveyor, propagator, disseminator would be the translations of the term pracharak. And it appears that by the late 1980s or mid-1980s, these remain not very precise because that's not how the RSS works. That's why we don't have very precise dates, but we have approximate dates for when he started working for the RSS. And then the RSS loaned him out, which is a very old tradition, to the BJP in mid to late 1980s. And he shot to prominence within the BJP circles when he was one of the key organizers of the Ayodhya movement. In 1991, he shot to prominence at that time. And then he became general secretary of the party. That was a very important position. And that is perhaps 2000 or 2001. And was appointed the chief minister of his state, Gujarat, when BJP was in power there. And then he won 3 elections, as you rightly put it, 2002, 2007, and 2012. 3 elections and became one of the most important chief ministers of the state of Gujarat ever. And in September of 2013, the party announced that he would be the candidate for prime minister if BJP came to power, as it did. So that's the background.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting to zoom into that period of his chief ministership of Gujarat, because it started with what might perhaps be the most notorious dent to his record, which were the 2002-2003 riots in Gujarat. And that stain seems to have carried on even up to 2014. It was an issue for him. But what was interesting for me was how he redeemed his reputation in Gujarat, and such that by 2013, when he became the candidate for prime minister, he was running on his record as a pro-development chief minister, which contributed to his image. So could you briefly explain how he managed to recover from that dent in his image from 2002?
So I think there are clearly, in retrospect, though it was not clear looking forward, clearly in retrospect, Mr. Modi has 3 dimensions, or at least 3 dimensions, to his political persona. One is personal incorruptibility. There may be all kinds of arguments about how BJP, his party, raises money, and there can be legitimate arguments made that not all of that is a sign of clean fundraising. Some of it is corrupt, no doubt, but that taint of corruption doesn't extend to his own life, his own personality, his own personal record. There's no doubt about that. Personally incorruptible. And generally in India, it is believed that parties raise resources not always in a clean way. So if BJP also raises money in not a very clean way, it is not an altogether damning indictment, because all parties have that problem. Political funding in India has not been for a long time particularly clean. And it's not simply a problem of the BJP. So one is personal incorruptibility. The second is Hindu nationalism, his ideology, which comes from the RSS, which essentially means that Hindus, as the majority community of India, have not been given their just status in the polity, and they should be viewed as they should be assigned a certain primacy, political, legal, and cultural primacy. Political and cultural for sure, and legal primacy is a project, I think, which is still in the making. So the notion that the Hindus are, if you will, the primary owners of the Indian nation and have been unjustly denied, quote unquote, that status by post-independence constitution and of India, and the post-independence political dispensation overall, is the second most important dimension of his political life. The third has always been development. Now, that starts with Gujarat, undoubtedly, and the development in a certain way, not very market-oriented development, but very business-oriented, or businesses collaborating with the government and government collaborating with businesses as a way to develop the state, and now as a way to develop India, at least in terms of growth rates. These 3 have always been there. To this has been added of late, perhaps that will feature later in our conversation, the idea of benefits, welfare benefits. But that emerged much later. These three in particular were part of his, were the three most significant parts of his political life after 2001, until he came to Delhi in 2014.
So, personal incorruptibility, Hindu nationalism, and development. So, these three elements came together in that campaign. It was a very interesting campaign. I remember it is one of the first campaigns I actively followed in my life. And what was interesting about it, he was relying on his personal popularity, but the BJP also had a very strong strategy. Could you maybe break down what were the factors that went into that campaign? Was it solely a majority because of Modi's persona? Or was there also an organized campaign that was much more efficient, let's say, than the opposition? Well, how did he manage to secure such a wide majority?
Right. The majority was not very wide at that time, but it was historically exceptional for the BJP. He managed to get more than 30% of vote, and he, in 2019, added 7 percentage points more to it. That is not as large as Congress Party in its heyday would get. Congress Party would easily cross 40%. He hasn't crossed that yet. However, the question you ask about 2014 campaign is a very important one. And to my mind, it's very important because Hindu nationalism was not the guiding theme of that campaign. It may have been a subterranean theme, the way the foot soldiers of the organization and the foot soldiers of the campaign went from door to door and tried to convince people to vote for the BJP and for Mr. Modi. But the campaign was built upon, of course, his personality and the notion of and the idea of personal incorruptibility, because he had no family. And in India, almost every politician who's ever participated, with very few exceptions, have had families, and they have tried to promote their families in politics. There are very few exceptions to this, and he is the biggest exception, in part because mainly because he does not have a family. And he was notionally married at the age of 18 to Yashoda Ben, who he left very soon, and then became basically a single person, to use a bachelor. No one knows whether the marriage was consummated or not. But in any case, he could not have been a pracharak, a disseminator of the RSS if he had been married. You have to be a bachelor to be a pracharak of the RSS. So it's reasonable to assume that the marriage was unconsummated. It's reasonable to assume that, and he essentially was a bachelor, even though technically he was married, and technically whether or not he divorced her, I have no idea. We don't have that information. But for all practical purposes, he was a bachelor and a single person, and that's why he joined the RSS. At any rate, the personal incorruptibility has been a feature of his life, political life, right since Gujarat. But the more important point, as far as I'm concerned, for the 2014 election, which I also followed very systematically, as I did the 2019 campaign also, and as I will 2024 as well. I think to my mind, it was primarily an anti-incumbency vote. Congress Party, with its allies, had been in power for 2 terms, for 10 years in a row, and starting 1 year or 1.5 years after its return to power in 2009, an unending series of corruption scandals kept breaking out, one after another, without any end in sight. So by the time Congress Party went to the people to seek a 3rd term, it was badly compromised. Corruption and misgovernance became very easy, as terms very easy, or charges as very easy to stick to the Congress Party. And Mr. Modi ran a campaign, and as I said, I very systematically followed it, campaign against the Congress Party dynasty, the Nehru-Gandhi family, against the corruption of Congress Party, and in favor of what he called Sushasan, which is good governance, and in favor of development, Vikas. After, though Congress Party in its first term and its allies in their first term did very well on economic growth. In the second term, they faltered. And you could say that development was was not something they could go to the masses with. Whereas Mr. Modi's Gujarat had developed quite well, even though with some spotty health and education record. But in terms of growth and income expansion, it had done very well under his chief ministership. And it was widely viewed as a fairly rich state, and also widely viewed as a state whose richness was attributable to Mr. Modi's governance and policies. So, in my view, the more important reason for the 2014 victory of the BJP was certainly not Hindu nationalism. Certainly not. I have written about it, and I'm convinced that was not the reason as a guiding theme. It was a serious anti-incumbency against the misrule and misgovernance of the Congress party, to which the personal incorruptibility of Mr. Modi and his development record in Gujarat, in his state, were added.
So you mentioned anti-incumbency as one of the primary factors that got him to power. But as you've seen in elections around the world, anti-incumbency might get you into power, but not necessarily keep you and then extend your mandate. And I think one of the undeniable facts of Indian politics post-2014 is the popularity of Narendra Modi, which helped him secure back-to-back majorities in 2014 and 2019, and it looks like 2024 from all reasonable estimates. What accounts for Modi's continued popularity in the Indian electorate? Do you think the voters have shifted their views to align more with Hindu nationalism, or are there other factors involved here?
So there is no doubt that 2019 campaign was the Hindu nationalist campaign, as opposed to the 2014 campaign. And so the voters, many more voters today are aligned with the ideology of Hindu nationalism than was true in 2013-14. No doubt about that. Historically, Hindu nationalism has been on the periphery of Indian politics, at least till 1988-89, it was on the periphery of Indian politics. It never won. Hindu nationalist political parties never won more than single digit votes in the election. They never touched even 10%, and they touched 12% for the first time in 1989. And since then, they have remained. They've remained between 12. They had remained before 2014 between 12 and 24 and 25%. And they reached the 30% milestone for the first time in 2014, and then 37 plus in 2019, which in a first past the post system, which India has, is very, very substantial, which allowed him to come to power with a majority for the first time for BJP in 2014, and with an increased majority, enhanced majority in 2019. So the two things he added were the Hindu nationalist campaign and more people beginning to align with that ideology. The second, which we should mention now, is welfare benefit. A huge welfare benefits campaign based on provision of sanitation, provision of cooking gas, and provision of income support. And that in turn was based on something very new in India. He essentially forced banks to open accounts for virtually everyone in India. And many of those were called zero balance accounts, which the banks, I don't think the banks could have easily resisted what the Prime Minister was asking them to do, even if it meant to begin with some losses. These were zero balance accounts, many of them. And they were created in order for there to be a direct transfer into those accounts for the government subsidies. And he was fairly successful, I would say substantially successful, in making direct benefit transfers to those accounts through the welfare benefit schemes, helping literally millions and millions, and you could say hundreds of millions of people who were initially dependent on mediators, right, who rather than direct transfers to their accounts. So once you had created zero balance accounts, government could make direct transfer, which is certainly a very large part of his popularity. No government before that had attempted something like that. He did, and with substantial success, not 100% success as his followers claim, but very substantial success, which mattered electorally, which converted a lot of poor people and especially lower caste people to begin to support him and support him quite vigorously. Every third Dalit of India in 2019, that is the lowest caste, as you know, every third Dalit of India in 2019 voted for the BJP, which was entirely, wholly inconceivable in the 1990s or in the first decade of the 21st century. It was entirely inconceivable, and that he managed to produce that support, primarily, I think, through benefits, but also through very, very astute campaigning among the Dalits and the lower caste of India.
Right. And I think that's an interesting contrast, because I think for a lot of Western listeners who might think of Narendra Modi as, let's say, a pro-market and pro-business, which you've said he's not, the idea that he actually has expanded and made more efficient the Indian welfare state stands as a bit of a contrast. But I want to draw attention to that comment you made about his popularity amongst the lower castes. Now, the BJP, at least before the 90s and definitely before Modi, was perhaps perceived as an upper caste North Indian party. And it seems to have consolidated a much larger base of support nationwide, amongst the lower castes and the Dalits, as you pointed out, but also in regions like the Northeast, which aren't exactly the heart of Hindu nationalism, at least in the past few decades. In fact, they have a huge Christian minority. How have they managed to do that? And why have they not managed to break into the South Indian states like they have in the East, let's say?
So let me begin with the qualification about the distinction that we draw in the field of political economy between pro-market orientation and pro-business orientation. We actually draw a distinction, and the distinction takes the following form. Pro-market, in a pro-market environment, the government does not select some companies or some corporations for targeted benefits and targeted attention. It simply lets the market process to decide who will win, who will lose, who will have what share of the market, etc. Mr. Modi appears to have followed what South Korea actually perfected, which is the idea of national champions or preferred businessmen who were given all kinds of benefits to lead the economy in some important rising sectors, right? So that was not achieved under Mr. Modi through a market-based principle, but selective usage of benefits and other interventions in favor of some corporate, right?
Right. So he's less Ronald Reagan and more Park Chung-hee. Correct.
Very good. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Or no table too after that. Yeah. Now. So that distinction having, let's put that aside for a moment, and let's talk about the other points you made. One, the penetration of lower castes by the BJP. Second, the penetration of the Northeast by the BJP, where a lot of population is Christian. And third, the lack of penetration of South India. The three points you raised. Now, there's no doubt that historically the BJP and Hindu nationalist organizations in general were viewed as upper caste dominated, and especially business caste dominated. But if you are an ambitious political party, there is not much political mileage there. The upper caste, let alone of which business caste would be one, upper caste as a whole, although we don't have precise census data, but we have good approximation. As a whole, the upper caste would not make up more than 18 to 20% of India, if that. It could be as low as 16 to 17% of India. It could be as low as that. Now, you cannot come to power with only 80% of the 16% voting for you. It's not possible. You need to go up to about 30% or so, right? In a first past the post system. 28, 29, 30, 31, etc. That's what you have to get to. That is not possible in India without figuring out how to incorporate lower castes, who are lower castes and the so-called OBCs, they're called lower castes, and the lowest are called the Dalits, right? They're about 15 to 16% of India. And the lower, so-called lower caste, above the lowest caste, but below the upper caste, which you can call the middle caste also. That is the category from which Mr. Modi himself comes, right? Originally. Now that particular, there's some doubt about whether originally it was the same, but let's put that aside for a moment, right? So the penetration of the OBCs, who could be as large as 50 to 54% of India, and the Dalits as large as 15 to 17% of India. Without penetrating these two sectors, you cannot come to power. And once the BJP realized that, it went in that direction, but it needed some kind of ideological support. So the fact that after the 1970s, the RSS, the mother organization itself, started thinking of changing its policy and not be entirely upper caste based, though the leadership came from the upper caste, but start penetrating the lower caste through its ideological dissemination and through its organizations, especially through the educational programs it ran, the health programs it ran, and the morning assemblies that expanded in a new direction. So that ideological thrust of increasing the base of Hindu nationalism by penetrating the lower castes and the lowest castes, that ideological thrust helped the BJP also, as the BJP moved beyond its upper caste base. And so that particular campaign, or the thrust, or new thrust that began in the 1980s, appears to have borne fruit in the 2010s, and more so by 2019 than 2010. So that's the dissemination of Hindu nationalist ideology towards the lower segments of Hindu society as a reasonably successful dissemination.
Right, and it's interesting.
Sorry.
No, I was just saying that I think one of the analysis that I heard was that the idea of Hindu nationalism in this sense was to try and be more inclusive in terms of caste in their political coalition, while simultaneously being more exclusive in terms of minorities, or in Muslims in particular. Would that be the correct analysis of the way this is proceeding?
Right, that's correct. Mm-hmm. So inclusiveness within the Hindu community and exclusion of minorities became, right, rather than exclusion of both lower segments of Hindu society and exclusion of minorities. Right. Inclusion vis-a-vis Hindus and exclusion vis-a-vis non-Hindus is one of the ways to think about that. Now, the Northeast penetration shows that even the exclusion of minorities, that strategy was modified, and that strategy then drew a prioritization about who is enemy number one. And the enemy number one, given India's history and given all the ideological texts of Hindu nationalism, the enemy number one became the Muslim. And it was possible to enter the Northeast through an alliance with Christian churches, right? And so once the ideological thrust becomes inclusive Hinduism and exclusion of minorities, but minorities prioritized, number one, number two, number three. Once you do that, then you can enter Northeast India, which has a very large Christian population, because Hindu nationalism was not defined in Northeast India as an anti-Christian movement or anti-minorities movement in general, but an anti-Muslim movement which did not affect Northeast India.
Right.
The third part of your question about its inability to penetrate South India has two dimensions, or maybe three, let's see. One is simply that South India historically, with two minor exceptions, or two exceptions, if not minor, two exceptions, South India general does not have the North Indian Hindu-Muslim tensions, which have historically prevailed, and certainly from the late 19th century onwards for sure, and 20th century absolutely for sure. The Pakistan movement, the breakup of India, that movement had very little support in South India, almost negligible support in South India, right? With the exception of Hyderabad state, which we can talk about in detail if you're interested, or if your audience is interested, and to some extent.
And I think in Kerala there was a Moppala movement or a Mollapa movement. I forgot the.
In Kerala, indeed.
Right.
Yes, there was, and that there are two ways to interpret that it was peasant versus landlord or Hindu versus Muslim. There are two ways to interpret, and the two actually began to coincide. Most peasants were Muslim and most landlords were Hindu, right?
Which brings a class dimension rather than just a religious dimension.
Simply a religious dimension there. Now, yes, so there was the possibility. I've written about the Mopla rebellion and what happened to Kerala politics as a result, but it couldn't be turned around. Despite, even if you give it a Hindu-Muslim interpretation, which you can, it's not that you cannot. I mean, the class element and the religious element became inextricably interwoven. So both interpretations are possible. Hindu-Muslim interpretation indeed can be given to that period, and there's enough evidence to show that played some role.
Right.
And not just some role, a fairly significant role. And not simply the class dimension. Both played roles, but both played significant role.
Right. And it's interesting because it's not like this region hasn't seen any conflict between, let's say, Hindus and Muslims or between different communities. They are the presence of the significant minorities in a place like Kerala, but the BJP never seems to have gotten traction there. But I'm actually from Mangalore, so I followed this a bit closely. That's become a sort of hotbed BJP support in Karnataka, which is also a South Indian state. So it's interesting to see the dichotomy, but in general, they seem to have performed less better in South India. So could you maybe elaborate why that?
Yeah. So basically, politics cannot be straightforwardly or in a one-to-one way deduced from either history or the structure of society. It matters what kinds of political organizations present what sort of interpretation of history and how they relate to the structure. So one of the important things that happened in Mopla is that Hindu nationalists did go there thinking that there was a great opportunity here for creating a Hindu nationalist base. But despite what happened in Mopla, in Malabar, the prior lower caste movement that had already emerged, came back to its prominence after the Mopla rebellion and restructured politics, and the Hindu-Muslim issues became less and less and less and less important. And the caste issues and class issues became more important. That's how the politics got organized there, right? And therefore, the same argument can be made about Telangana, which was ruled by the Nizam until 1948, a Muslim ruler, and at least the last 10 years of his rule had a lot of Hindu-Muslim tension and a lot of fairly legitimate complaints that he favored Muslims against Hindus. Very legitimate complaints. I've studied Hyderabad also, 1937 onward. However, once again, the parties that emerged reconstructed history, reconstructed the messages, and instead of emphasizing this period, emphasized something else, and managed to get enough popular support for their reinterpretation of the history, or the argument that this period, 37 to 48, this 11-year period, was a short, if you will, deviation from a larger tendency, historical tendency. So that's a matter for politicians to do, political parties to do. This is why political party campaigns, the strategies you have are extremely important that don't have one-to-one relationship with history or with the structure of society, right? Mm-hmm. Now, right. What is therefore, now, the fact that Hindu-Muslim differences beyond Mangalore or beyond Malabar and basically this district in Calicut, I mean, that's what it is, the Calicut district and the district next to it, which is a Muslim majority district, and Hyderabad, parts of Hyderabad. Beyond that, the India-Pakistan issues or Hindu-Muslim issues had virtually no resonance. So you would have to create some other ways to enter. In Kerala, please note that the BJP is trying to enter through the churches. It's the same strategy as the Northeast strategy.
That's very interesting.
It's entering because it has made it is very clear to them that an anti-minority stand per se, covering all minorities, would not be politically wise, would not be strategically wise. Concentrate on enemy number one, which is Muslims for them, has been in almost every text says that. You can read every ideological text says that. Christians were number two in those texts. They were, but now they are that particular understanding is being turned into a form of politics, right? which you first saw in Northeast India, where the distinction was clearly made. And now they're trying to use the churches to enter, or some of the prominent churches, there are lots of them, some of the prominent churches to enter Kerala. They may or may not succeed. The likelihood as of now is that they will not succeed, because the Christian politics in Kerala is aligned in a certain way, and it is very hard to dismantle the existing structures of Christian politics in Kerala. And Christians are, as you know, a very large proportion of Kerala population.
So it's interesting because I think you've helped dismantle the sort of monolithic understanding we have of the BJP's politics and of Hindu nationalism in general, and perhaps introduce our listeners to a more nuanced understanding of how caste and class and economics play a role in the BJP's politics. But I'm sure, moving on to, let's say, the 2024 campaign, I'm sure you followed the inauguration of the Ram Temple in Ayodhya this January. To me, it signaled the official or unofficial start to the 2024 election campaign, and the BJP is expected to win. But in your view, what do you think are the prospects for BJP and Modi this cycle? Do you think they might be able to retain or increase their current majority? Or do you foresee some problems that could derail the BJP's victory or reduce the majority?
So I will start with a technical point, which is also a point of wisdom. Namely, you should not have point estimates about politics. You should have interval estimates. That's a technical point. That is to say, you can have an upper bound and lower bound in your estimate, but you should not give a point estimate, because it's an impossibility, right? It's an impossibility. People always ask you about point estimates, and that's not how political scientists can answer the question. The question can only be, what are the upper bounds, what are the lower bounds of the interval estimate, right? And I don't see how the upper bound of 370, which is what 370 out of 543, which is what Mr. Modi has already announced, how that can be reached. First it was 400, now he says 400 including allies, and 370 for BJP. I just don't see how that
it seems a tad ambitious.
Yeah, that is not something I can attest to as a high probability outcome with my political knowledge. And if I'm proved wrong, I'll happily accept my mistake, a mistaken understanding, and then we would like then obviously understand why something so entirely inconceivable. He has done some fairly inconceivable political achievements to his credit, but this may be a bit too far. So I see the upper bound around what he has already, a little bit maybe above that. He has 303 right now in Parliament out of 543. So he has 55 or 56% of the lower house, Lok Sabha, the directly elected house with him. And I'd see that as the upper bound, maybe 5 or 6 more or 7 more, 310 you can talk about. Maybe you can go to 315. And the uppermost bound could be something like 320, which is big enough. I don't see 370. The lower bound is a more interesting speculation, and that depends on some major states, what happens there, and we can analyze that if you're interested. But the lower bound could be something like 240 plus minus, which will be roughly 30, 32, 33, 35, 25 short of a majority, right? And that will create all kinds of issues of alliance making, and that will also reduce his power to a substantial extent, right? If he wins again entirely on his own and wins more than 303 seats, which is the seats he got, and let's say achieves more than 40% vote share, which is probably what will have to happen in order for him to get to 320 or 315. I think he may have to get to 43, 44% of the vote, and it's another 7% added to 37.5. If he gets there, then we should expect very serious Hindu nationalism, not only in governance and symbols, but probably in laws, because control over parliament can be then used to generate new laws, which are more keeping with the ideology. Ayodhya for me was the beginning, symbolic and ideological beginning of a Hindu nationalist political order, very different from the constitutional political order, but achieved legally through. It can be achieved legally. It's not yet there. So it was a symbolic beginning. The idea that religion, the majority religion and the state can be so fused together, which is against India's constitution. And in order for this to go forward, laws will have to be changed. And if he has 320 members of parliament voting in his support, then the laws can be changed.
Right. And I'm interested too, when talking about the lower bounds, you talked about some states to watch. And to my mind, it seems peculiar because I'm not sure where he can expand the coverage BJP seats. We've already seen he's not done too well in the south. In fact, they lost one of the major states, Karnataka. And in the Hindi heartland, I'm not sure where he has room to expand. He dominates that area already. There's a bit more of a toss-up in places like Bihar and Maharashtra. But what states do you think people who are watching this election should pay particular attention to?
That is exactly the reason it will be very hard to go above 303 and in any case substantially above. That's exactly. He's maxed out in Bihar. He had 39 seats there out of 40. He had 63 in UP. Maybe he can win all 80. It's possible. In which case he adds 17 from there. But it's not clear he can win 39 in Bihar. And it's not clear that he can win 40, 41 in Maharashtra, which is the second largest state of India after UP. He has maxed out on Gujarat, more or less maxed in Madhya Pradesh, maxed in Rajasthan, was very close to maxing Haryana, and it's not clear he can get much more in Punjab. You can say these are smaller states. Of course, our focus should be on bigger and middle-sized states. So the 5 biggest states of India, UP 1, Maharashtra 2, Bihar 3, West Bengal 3, Bihar 4, and Tamil Nadu 5. Right, and then the medium-sized states, Karnataka, Karnataka, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and you could add Odisha and Kerala to it. You can come right down to 20, let's say, and you'll have to add Telangana or Andhra Pradesh to it. So I don't see Mr. Modi as of now winning 26 out of 28 seats in Karnataka. I don't see him winning all 7 seats in Delhi. And I think he'll win more than 63. He can win more than 63 in UP. I think UP addition is possible of 10 to 12, certainly is possible. I don't see him winning 39 out of 40 in Bihar. And I don't see him winning more than 18 in Bengal. So yes, that is the basis for my claim. That exactly your reasoning is my reasoning. It's hard to see how much higher it can be, given that he's maxed north and west. And northeast is he can go up maybe in Odisha if he constructs a good alliance. Bengal, he's maxed the what is called northeast. Technically, he's maxed there. So I don't know where the 70 seats that he says will be added, 67 seats to 303, where they'll come, unless southern India is completely transformed, which is unlikely.
Well, that's a brilliant breakdown. And I think despite a lot of predictions coming from abroad and India of Mr. Modi producing another clean sweep or a majority, I think there are plenty of factors that can throw this decision off. So Professor Varshney, thanks so much for joining us and giving us a brilliant analysis. And I'm sure you, like all our listeners, are going to be paying attention to the Indian election coming up in April, May. So let's see how that goes. But thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome. And it was wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Professor. And that's all we have time for this episode of Beyond the Indus. I found that fascinating. I hope you all did too. Join us next month where we'll be looking into the opposition, the Congress and the India Alliance. So looking forward to that. Hope you all join us again. Take care and bye.